Hi, everybody, and welcome to Odd Week Sunday School at St. Andrew's Covenant Presbyterian Church. This is our lesson for January 17th, 2021, the year we've all been waiting for. This week we have a story from the Old Testament about a very young man who eventually recognizes a call from God to special service, and about the difficult first duty that he was asked to perform. It's actually a much nicer story if we leave off the second part, because if we leave off the second part about the difficult duty, then it's just a story of a boy who makes good, a virtuous child honored by God. But we're going to look at both parts. It comes from one of the Old Testament's history books, the book of 1 Samuel. The text for today is 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 20. 1 Samuel 3, 1 to 20. Of course, there's a real big chunk of the Old Testament that narrates the history of the people of Israel and Judah as they arrive in and take possession of the promised land, the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. There's history in practically every book of the Bible, but there are several books that are really histories in and of themselves. Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and also Ezra and Nehemiah tell these stories. The books of Samuel offer a political and theological history of Israel. That is, a history of what God does in the history of this nation and what the Israelites do in response. Like all history books, the book of Samuel offers a series of facts that the author says have been verified, and in an interpretation of what those facts mean. 1 Samuel opens at a moment of a great turning point in the history of Israel. Up to now, God had been using prophets and priests to lead these people from Egypt on a long journey in the wilderness and to the new land. Moses, and then Moses' hand-picked successor Joshua, and then a series of judges, both male and female, who did not provide what we would think of as a sort of actual centralized government, but who could offer judgments when people faced disputes among themselves. All of this was a difficult time in the history of Israel. There was a lot of disagreement among the people themselves, and there was lots of fighting between the Israelites and the people who inhabited the land they were coming into. And besides these judges, the main authorities in Israel were priests. Priests presided over sacrifices at the tent of meeting, or the sort of portable tabernacle that the Israelites carried along with them. And these priests were very special people. They were descendants of Aaron, Moses' family, Moses' brother. Ultimately, they were all descendants of Levi, the founder of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. They were Levites. This line of people had a special mission, a specific assignment from God way, way back in time to oversee the people's worship of God and to oversee their adherence to God's law. But as the book of 1 Samuel opens, we learn that neither God nor the people are entirely satisfied with this arrangement, with this kind of government, or with this level of observance of God's laws. Specifically, God is about to replace the priestly house that existed at that time with someone new. And shortly thereafter, the people are going to approach God to ask him for a human king. That is, for the kind of government that all of their neighbors have, which they say they want. So that's where the curtain rises on 1 Samuel. The passage for today, to give some context to this, starts with a childless woman named Hannah. The context of today's passage starts with her. Hannah's story, well, she's married to a righteous man who has 2 wives, and the other wife has children, but Hannah doesn't. It's a sad, even desperate situation for Hannah that she is childless. Every year, as the law requires, this family, Hannah and her husband and the other wife and the children, traveled to Shiloh, the designated city or place, to make a sacrifice there as required by law. This is before Jerusalem existed. And there they encountered the chief priest of Israel, Eli, his name is, who ministers there with his sons. Now, Eli by now is very old. His eyesight is failing. And God is displeased with him, we find out, because his sons are completely out of control. They are taking bribes. They are generally carrying on in a way that insults God's holy place and insults God's laws. They are encouraging disrespect for God and others. And God seems to expect Eli to get these boys under control or else to kick them out of their priestly roles. But Eli seems to have some trouble perceiving what's going on with people. For example, in the occasion that brings this story about, Hannah goes up to Shiloh and she wants to pray to God for a child. So she goes near the door of this tabernacle, the tent of meeting, where Eli is sitting on a chair. Hannah's praying, and she's praying very fervently. She doesn't pray out loud, but she's so lost in this prayer that her lips are moving. And Eli can see that her lips are moving with no sound coming out. And Eli at first concludes that Hannah is drunk. And he tells her to get rid of her wine. Hannah informs Eli that she's not drunk. She's praying for a child. She wants God to give her a child. And she's had neither wine nor beer, she says. Incidentally, while wine is the most biblical of drinks, this is one of the very few biblical references to beer that I'm aware of. In either case, Hannah hasn't had any of either thing. In her prayer, Hannah has been begging God for a son, and she's made a promise to God that if she should bear a son, she will dedicate him to the Lord's service. Well, now Eli comes to understand what's going on with this woman, and he sends her home with his blessing, and he says he too will ask God to answer her prayer in the way that she wants it to be answered. So let me just pause at this point and ask, are we at the part in this story where we hear the voice of God yet? Is God speaking yet? Well, to take Hannah's story a step further, it comes to pass. The Lord sends her a son, whom she names Samuel. Hannah's the mother of this Samuel fellow. She names him Samuel, a word that means God hears. She carries through on her promise, and as soon as he's old enough, very young, she sends Samuel up to Shiloh to Eli to be trained for the priesthood. And thereafter, we're told that Hannah gave birth to several more children, both sons and daughters. So let's read the passage that we have for today. Samuel is by now a young assistant to Eli at the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and I'm going to read from 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 to 20. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call. Lie down again." So Samuel went and lay down. The Lord called again, "Samuel." Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel didn't know that the Lord and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Then the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever." Samuel lay there till morning, and then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli, but Eli called Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son." Samuel said, "Here I am." Eli said, "What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he told you." So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. And then he said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. So this is a story where God actually speaks with a voice, we're told. Do you think that really happens? Do you think it happens still? Does God ever speak with a voice that a human being can hear as a voice? Well, Dallas Willard wrote a book that I think is really an interesting and deep book called Hearing God. We have it in the library, so I recommend it. And Dallas Willard writes in his book that although he has never heard God's voice, he's willing to believe people who say that they have. So Willard accepts that this is possible. It is scriptural. But Willard offers some good insights into how it is that God's voice might more often come to us in our day. It comes still and small. It comes through Scripture taken as a whole, the spirit of the Scriptures. It comes through others who speak to us. It can come through the natural world, the voice of God, and it comes through our own experiences in life. Nonetheless, when we suspect, says Willard, or believe that we have heard the voice of God, that we've heard a call from God, we need to test whether God is really the source of this word and not just we ourselves or one who means us harm. Willard offers Scripture as a good guide to whether or not a word can be from God. But not just random verses of the Bible. Willard warns us against proof texting or selecting a sentence out of context. Willard says only the Bible as a whole can assure us that something is consistent with who God is, something that we've heard. The Bible that we get to know by spending time with it. But Willard's short answer to the question, how can we know if it's God's voice that we're hearing, is experience. Maybe we sometimes wish that God would be more direct with us, that he'd stop being elusive and mysterious and just speak so that we could hear him without any question or debate, because we are very, very tired of questions and debate. Just speak to us, Lord, so that everyone knows who's speaking and what you're saying. And we won't have to interpret what you mean, because we'll all hear your voice and then we'll all agree on what you said. Well, if we think that, this is a good story to reflect on, this story about God calling Samuel. Because that's what God did here. God actually spoke with his voice to Samuel, but Samuel still didn't know that it was God that was speaking. It turns out that even though God's speaking was a fact, it was a fact that Samuel could not grasp until someone helped him to interpret it. Fact and interpretation are both essential elements in grasping the truth about what's going on. Old Eli, who was not a perfect priest and who couldn't see very well anymore, was finally the one who grasped that it was the Lord calling Samuel. And Eli told Samuel how he ought to respond. So Samuel did. And God gave Samuel a tough assignment, some bad news that he was to deliver to Eli. And then we're told Samuel lay there till morning. Well, he didn't rush out to deliver the bad news, did he? What was he doing? Maybe he was mulling over this assignment, mulling over what the Lord had asked him to do. Well, is there something special about Samuel? Yes, we've heard about his birth. Is this an honor to be called the way that Samuel was called? Well, it seems so to me. Does Samuel deserve any credit for answering the call? Did he have any choice? Yes and yes. When Samuel opens the door of the house of the Lord, he has to face Eli, and it's here that we see him decide to accept his mission. He's saying yes to God. And even here, Eli encourages him, and at a cost to himself. So what do we learn from this perhaps familiar story about what it takes for Samuel to recognize and honor the call of God? Well, for one thing, it requires the help of other people. Hannah, his mother, who literally put him in the place where he would hear the voice of God. And then Eli, his teacher, his priest, his mentor. And what Eli brought to the equation was not perfection, but experience, the experience even of old age. And then, did you hear this at the very end? The community's affirmation to Samuel as the days went on. All of Israel from Dan to Beersheba believed that he was a spokesman for God, a reliable spokesman for God. What about Samuel's own qualities? What qualities did he bring to the table as a person who would answer God's call? Well, he was in a place where it was possible to hear God's voice. It was quiet in there. And he was someone who was already attuned to the reality of an invisible God. He had a willingness to ask someone that he trusted to help him understand what he was hearing. And when he understood that he'd been commissioned, he engaged in some self-reflection and a decision. Even in the face of a mission that was not entirely pleasant, because there was the possibility that fulfilling this call would cost Samuel something. Maybe Eli would become angry. Samuel realized that accepting God's charge meant trusting God, even though Samuel didn't know everything that was going to happen next. Sometimes we seek a sign or a word from God because we really want to know what's going to happen next. And it may be one of God's many mercies that he doesn't very often reveal that to us. It's a burden to know. But more than learning the future here, what Samuel has done is embark on a lifelong conversation with God. The conversation deepens their relationship. And this relationship with God is what enables Samuel to live out his days in God's service with confidence in God's guidance. And that conversation might work for us too. So until we meet again, stay well.